All right, so everyone's talking about how challenging the upcoming couple of years are going to be from a budget perspective, and that means you need to take control of how dollars flow out of your organization. So, how do you do that? Well, it starts with the data, and specifically data on how, where, when, and with what frequency purchases are being made all across your various departments. You may or may not have a procure-to-pay platform that makes it easy to measure this type of activity, but to get you inspired, you should go check out Procurify's brand new Charter School Benchmark Report. It just came out a couple weeks ago and offers 10 procurement benchmarks from charter schools across the country, highlighting things like average PO volumes, spend per vendor, items per vendor, how long it takes to go from requisition to PO, and so on. Not only will you be intrigued to answer these same questions for your school, it might also shine a light on opportunities for cost control next year. You can go to procurify.com/resources to download a copy or check out the episode description, and we've linked to it there as well. All right, now back to the show.
Welcome to Charter School Insider, lessons from the nation's top charter school operators, the only podcast dedicated to the behind-the-scenes business of running a successful charter school. Join us as we sit down with charter school leaders who share how they are overcoming the biggest operational hurdles facing their schools today.
Lana, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here. It's good to see you.
Thanks. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I want to jump right in. What's going on with charter schools in Maine? Give us a quick update for those in our listenership who know nothing about the landscape of charter schools in Maine.
Sure. Would love to. Well, it's great to be in Maine. Love being here. And the charter school world in Maine is pretty interesting. There's a very unique ecosystem of schools in Maine, and Maine has a really long history of school choice. So charters are actually relatively new to this state. A law was passed in 2011 that allowed charter schools, making Maine the 41st state that allowed public charter schools. So we were late adopters. And then Maine's first charter schools opened in the 2012-2013 school year. So in Maine, we have traditional district public schools, we have independent schools. There are Maine town academies, which are partially public and partially private. And then there are charter schools. So it's interesting. And Maine currently has a cap of 10 charter schools in the state. So it's a small network. There are approximately 2,700 students who attend charter schools in Maine, which is just 1% of the student population up here.
Oh, wow. Okay, interesting. And so you're the executive director of the Maine Charter Commission. How long have you been in that role? I know you mentioned charters themselves have been relatively new, 2012, 2013. How long have you been in this role? And then can you also share a little bit about what the Maine Charter Commission is? Like, what is that entity?
So I joined the Maine Charter School Commission in January of 22 as the chief of staff. And then I've been in the executive director position for a little bit over a year. So the Maine Charter School Commission is the state authorizer for charter schools in Maine. And so an authorizer reviews applications for charter schools, authorizes those schools to come into existence, then monitors the performance of those schools over the course of typically a 5-year charter contract. And then at the end of the 5-year contract decides, is that school going to be renewed for an additional 5 years and keep functioning as a school? Or is it going to be closed because it hasn't met the promises that it made to students and families in the charter?
All right. So I want to talk more about this, and I want to talk about life as an authorizer, because I also happen to know that you have a unique background coming into this role. Could you share just a little bit about what you were doing prior to coming to Maine as chief of staff and now leading the Maine Charter Commission?
I just moved up to Maine a couple of years ago, so it's a kind of new lifestyle for me, and this is my first job on the authorizer side. I've always been on the school operator side. I've been really lucky to work at some amazing schools and organizations that have taught me a lot. So I started teaching in 2003 in New York City as part of Teach for America. And I was then fortunate after that to join the founding teaching team of an elementary school of a just great charter school network in Boston called Enrook Charter School, which has now expanded to 3 K-8s and a high school in Boston. And that's also where I met my husband. So that was a special bonus for me. And then I was the founding principal of Up Academy Dorchester in Boston, which was the first in-district K-8 turnaround charter school in Boston, where I'm still a board member. And then most recently, before joining the commission, I was the chief academic officer at Excel Academy Charter Schools, which is a truly wonderful charter network operating in East Boston, Chelsea, and then most recently in Providence, Rhode Island. And in that role, I worked just very closely with the school principals on just kind of every aspect of running a school.
So you, as you mentioned, the majority of your experience has been on the operator side and not authorizer. I'm going to get those two confused in the conversation. But before we get into life as an authorizer, because I want to talk more about that and your experience today, what was your relationship at the various schools that you worked with your authorizers? So kind of being on the other side of the coin. I'm curious to hear a little bit about that before we jump to the other side of the coin.
Yeah, so working in Boston, I would say my relationship with the authorizers there was both productive and also relatively formal. I mean, the authorizers were in the mix during school renewal in a big way. They would come and visit the schools, we would take them through classrooms. And then I was always grateful for the feedback they provided as really critical friends in the work. And they were able to say, here's what we're seeing in the school that's going well. Here are the places where we think you need improvement. And there's real authority in what they're saying because they have the power to shut you down if it comes to that. I was lucky in the relationships I had with the authorizer in Boston. It never felt like a punitive type of relationship, even when there were room for improvement. They were always great about providing that and a timeline for allowing the school to sort of meet those goals.
Were you nervous at all in taking this position that you're in now, where you're the one accepting the feedback and thinking about the renewal strategy and making sure that the authorizer continued to be supportive of the work? Were you nervous at all about making the transition to then being on the other side?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think I was nervous about it. I feel really happy that I had the experience of working in schools for as long as I did before making the transition. I frankly can't imagine doing this job without having that experience because I can really empathize with what the schools and school leaders are going through in terms of the pressure they feel from all fronts, but also from the authorizer. But then on the flip side of that, I also really know what's possible when you want to provide a great education for students and families, and the work that it takes to run a great school to be able to do that. And so I think having done the work allows me to understand where they're coming from and have kind of flexibility and empathy in the relationships, but also hold a high bar for expectations. Because ultimately, we're all in this work because we want to see great schools. We want to see great things happening for students and families. And we should be working together to make that happen. So I think I was excited joining this job to have the opportunity to kind of bring that perspective and really see if we could take a team approach to school building.
Really interesting. And so in thinking about the role of the authorizer a bit further, I think there's different opinions, and probably those opinions are based on different experiences. Depending on who you talk to, you might get a wide range of responses to tell me about your authorizer. How are things going with your authorizer? I just got back from a week in Long Beach, California for the California Charter Conference, and there are some challenging relationships that charter schools and networks are navigating there. So this is a timely conversation. As you think about the different buckets or the different roles that an authorizer plays, how would you describe those different buckets? And then how would you describe perspectives on the role of the authorizer, just either based on your own experiences or kind of as you've stepped into this role and networked with other authorizers? Maybe just speak a little bit to where you feel like the various camps are when it comes to the role of the authorizer.
Well, the role of the authorizer, I think, should be pretty straightforward. I mean, as you know very well, charter schools are publicly funded schools and operate, for the most part, independently of a traditional district public school system. And with that flexibility, they're given accountability toward their charter contract. And that is a contract that they hold with their authorizer. And so it is the authorizer's responsibility to ensure that those schools are fulfilling the promises that they said in their charter contract. And so what an authorizer should be doing, I think, is, of course, accepting new applications. So having a rigorous review process where you
Right.
look at applications. And then most of the work is looking at then kind of the life cycle of the charter school, and every year evaluating if the school is meeting the criteria that they should be meeting. And so most states, in Maine, we have a performance framework, which is part of the charters. And it's basically a rubric that shows academically, financially, governance, operations, what are the expectations that we have for a school's performance. And we evaluate how the school's doing on those every year. And then at the end of that 5-year charter term, the authorizer decides, can you keep going? Are you doing a good job? Or do we have really significant concerns here and we are not going to renew the school? And then there's usually a middle ground. You can renew with conditions, right? We're renewing you, but there are some places where we want you to improve. So that's the sort of typical role that an authorizer plays, and I think a really important role. As I mentioned before, I really feel like this is sort of a team approach between the authorizer, charter school leadership, and the charter school board together to ensure that there is a great school happening. I think the camps that you're talking about, potentially a little bit, you can correct me here if I'm wrong, but there are some authorizers who lean more toward supporting schools, and some who I think lean more toward just truly being in the evaluative camp. My personal perspective is I think you can have a balance of both really well. So there are ways, and I'm happy to talk kind of more about those if that's helpful, but there are ways that an authorizer can kind of be all in with the school and doing everything it can to support student achievement at that school and support the school to be great, and maintain the perspective to be unbiased when it comes to evaluation, which is a really important part of the authorizer role too. I think probably based on my personal background as a school operator, I lean towards support, but come at it with the knowledge of our responsibility as an authorizer that we're not an advocacy group and that we need to be able to kind of clearly hold schools accountable to the goals in our performance framework at the end of the day.
Do you feel like the different types of authorizers, like depending on who the authorizer is, do you feel like that allows for the core charter contract mandate of authorizing the school, holding them accountable, managing renewal? Do you think that, I guess, steers authorizers one direction or another in terms of what you just described, which is sometimes people maybe lean a little bit more on the support side or on the advocacy side for the school versus the, we're here to maintain high standards and shut you down if the standards are not met?
It's a really good question. And I'm relatively new still to the authorizing world. And so I'll give you my best shot at an answer, but there's a lot I don't know. So there are different entities that can authorize schools nationally. There's state authorizers, which is where I work. There are universities that authorize schools. There are districts that authorize schools. And what I imagine happens is that based on the values of the organization that is the authorizer, that you then have different criteria that you're looking for in terms of school performance. So coming from the state authorizing position, we're comparing the schools in Maine to the state in a lot of ways. So achievement-wise, academics, how are you doing compared to the state? Attendance, those are it's a hot topic right now. If you are, let's say, a district, in addition to looking at some of those state accountability metrics, you might also have real priorities at the district level that you are interested in seeing schools pursue. And so I imagine that would come into, your lens when you're looking at how a charter is doing. And then completely at the university level, I could imagine that happening. If you have a university with a specific mission, you very well want the charters that you're authorizing to have components of that mission baked into their DNA. And so I can imagine that how you look at school performance based on where you're coming from as an authorizer could really change just based on the values of the organization.
Yeah, I think that's a really good commentary on it, because it is super interesting that all three of those examples you described essentially have the same mandate, but those are very different organizations. If you're a local school district, as you said, maybe something like enrollment and how enrollment is playing out in your district and how enrollment looks at the charter schools that you authorize, like that, that's clearly a different situation than if you're a state authorizer and, you're maybe less concerned about enrollment demographics in one particular school district. So I do think it's interesting that there are these different types of authorizers, but yet they all have kind of the same mandate. As you think about your own experience, you talked about kind of holding the line of it is possible to both provide accountability and support for schools. I think that's the right perspective. How have you experienced that with the schools that you all support, the 9 schools in Maine that the commission authorizes? Have you felt some of that tension? How have you tried to navigate that?
I think that, like I said before, authorizers can support schools, but they shouldn't be the advocacy organization. So authorizers can focus on monitoring, authorizing, evaluating with a lens towards supporting schools to succeed. And then there are other groups that do advocacy. So in Maine, we have the Maine Charter School Alliance, which is our advocacy organization, and they can focus more on acting legislative changes or campaigns to increase enrollment, rallying families in support of charter schools. So I think it's inappropriate for the authorizer to engage directly in that advocacy work because it can really muddy the waters when it comes time to evaluate. In Maine, we are the authorizer and we are able to provide support to the schools. And so, I have the benefit of us being a pretty small group of schools. We're 9 schools. We have one opening for one more charter school in Maine, which would make our 10th school, and then we're at the cap. And all the schools in Maine are these really unique small schools that have missions that are tied deeply into the communities that they're serving. So we have a STEM school, an art school, an agriculture school, a school that's focused on bringing sort of Maine culture and ecology to the forefront of what they're doing. And so because of all those unique missions and the size, we're able to share a lot with each other. So I have the benefit of meeting with the schools often and hearing about their successes and challenges. I think all authorizers have that benefit. You're in the mix with them. When I hear about the successes that schools are experiencing, I can act as a coordinating function to get that information to the other schools so that we're all learning from each other. So, I, for example, facilitate a monthly meeting with the other charter schools, and one component of that meeting is best practice sharing. Then on the flip side, when I hear about challenges that are common among the schools, we can use that time to facilitate sort of a problem of practice or a best practice sharing with how do you overcome certain challenges. And then I am in the position of hearing from all of the schools, and I can help schools identify trends of challenges across all schools. And then I basically have the capacity to invite experts into the conversation to support them. So I can give you an example of that. I recently had mid-year meetings with all of our schools where we get to go through, how are you doing now? How are you going to be doing toward the end of the year? Anything we should be talking about before it really becomes important.
Right. Give me the heads up.
Give me the heads up. And in those conversations, I noticed that, fundraising kept coming up as something that the schools were struggling to get their hands around because they're small. They didn't have the team capacity or the board capacity internally necessarily. And so I invited sort of national expert in charter school fundraising to join us for one of our meetings, our monthly meetings, to present some ideas about what the schools could be doing for fundraising. So I think there are, kind of get back to your original question, I think that there are ways the authorizer can work to sort of hear trends across the schools and then coordinate resources to support schools. We also, the Maine Charter School Commission, funds specific things for the schools. And so there's a tech component that schools can opt into a specific student information system that we fund. If we require it in the framework, we pay for it. So we require schools to do a post-secondary readiness assessment. We'll pay for that, sort of some things like that. And then the commission also has put a bucket of money aside as an innovation fund that schools can apply to. And so, yeah, it's kind of interesting. So schools can apply with innovative idea that they have. If they are funded to see that idea through, we then ask that they, share that idea sort of formally with the other schools with the idea of sort of growing best practices. So I think those are just some examples. You can start to see how we in Maine at least sort of view our authorizing as a way to certainly hold schools accountable to high standards and allow them to share best practices with each other and bring resources to the table that allow us all to get where we want to go, which is great schools for kids.
Yeah, I love the idea of the authorizer not being afraid to be a connector of problems because, like you said, especially, obviously it's unique that the commission authorizes all the charters in the state and it is a smaller group. And so it is probably easier to do that. But having kind of seeing the forest for the trees as someone who works across all of those schools and being able to be a connector of problem solving seems like a natural place to get ahead of challenges for schools and ultimately keep those schools and, as you mentioned, keep them aligned with their mission, move them positively towards renewal. I was curious to ask you, since you were on the school side for so long, now that you've been in this role for a couple of years, do you have any recommendations for school leaders in thinking about how to better work with their authorizer? Because I would imagine for you, you have different relationships with your schools, and maybe some of those are easier than others to best support those schools and those leaders. And you don't have to call anyone out. We can speak in broad generalities on how schools can maybe better work with their authorizer now that you have been on both sides of the equation.
Sure. Yeah. I think my best advice there would be for schools to just be as transparent as possible with their authorizers. And so basically don't leave the authorizer guessing as to your current status. How are you doing performance-wise or to your future plans? The more that the authorizer can be involved in kind of understanding where you are as a school in your kind of success at any given point, and then what you're thinking about for the future, the better. Authorizers are people, and they like to get the heads up.
There's probably like a bumper sticker for charter school authorizers. We're people too, or something like that. Yeah.
And so, I think that maybe that's just really obvious advice, but there I've seen, and this actually isn't in Maine, I'm thinking toward in the past, but I've seen examples of charter organizations planning really big moves and, getting excited about things and just leaving the authorizer in the dark in such a way that when it came down to decision making to actually like approve an expansion or something like that, the authorizer just didn't have enough information to be able to say yes or no, or they said no because they didn't have enough information to say yes. Or there were concerns that came up at the last minute with the authorizer that if they had had the information before, they could have worked with the school around those challenges and gotten to a different outcome at the end. So I think my advice would be the authorizer wants to work with you. And, I don't know every authorizer, so I'm just maybe speaking for myself.
Yeah.
But
hopefully that's the case.
That's the case. And the best case scenario is you're giving each other as much transparent information as humanly possible to get to kind of the best outcome at the end.
Makes sense. So transparency and communication early and often, and then hopefully your authorizer will work with you as a long-term partner and not as kind of a punitive last moment stamper of approval for your projects and plans.
Right. And then, I would just add, I think to get to kind of the funny part about how authorizers are people, I do think relationships matter. And the authorizer cares about children and education. I mean, that's why they got into the game. And reach out to them, brainstorm ideas, get feedback, do it together.
Love it. Love it. All right. Well, as we wrap, any interesting resources that you found either for schools in working with their authorizer, or as you kind of made this transition, any kind of resources that you found interesting in learning about being an authorizer or thinking about how to effectively do this work that we could include in the show notes, or resources or people we could point others to?
Sure. Yeah. Well, as I said before, I'm kind of new to the world of authorizing. So I've had to lean on folks who know a lot more about this than I do. So I've really enjoyed working with an organization called the National Charter School Institute. They work nationally with a whole bunch of different authorizers. And similar to how I was kind of talking about being a conduit for sharing practices of schools, they really do the same for authorizers. And so they've been able to connect me with different authorizers that I can learn from. And then, NACSA is sort of the leading organization for authorizers. So they do really similar great work in connecting folks and best practice sharing. As we were putting together an application this year to invite a new charter school to come to Maine, I was reviewing our application and thinking, what innovations have happened recently in charter school applications? Are there more things that we should be considering? Are there things we should maybe take out of this application? Those organizations I mentioned, those are the people who can help you with that kind of work so that you're not all alone researching on your own.
Love it. Super cool. All right. So last question. What are you excited about right now with charter schools in Maine? And are there any opportunities that you want to highlight? I know we've alluded a couple times in this conversation that there's one more available school charter to bring the community from 9 to 10. Are there any other kind of Maine specific things that you want to highlight for our audience?
Well, I said this before, but I've worked in New York City and Boston before in charter schools, and Maine is really different. There are these small schools up here that are super focused on the missions that I mentioned before, have deep ties to their communities, and really just care about each other as a cohort of schools. And then also, Maine is unique in that charters here are truly part of the ecosystem of larger educational options for students. I've certainly been in situations before where charters were more adversarial with traditional public schools. I mean, there's that kind of national narrative that happens.
Sure.
And, I would say up here, there's certainly components of that in every state, but because of the way Maine has this really interesting history of school choice, charter schools have become one more option for students in a state that already sort of embraced choice before. And so this is, I guess, my pitch to anyone who might be listening who wants to open a charter school in Maine. We have one more slot open.
That's right.
The official application will be coming out in July and then is due in February. And it is a great place to run a charter school. I mean, there is a lot of support. There's a lot of ties to the community. There's great resources up here. And it's like really fun to live in Maine, let's be honest.
I was just going to say, not to mention living in Maine. Yeah. For all the cool reasons. Yeah. Right. Exactly. Why people go on vacation to Maine.
Yes. It's beautiful. Come in the summer and then decide if you want to open a charter school here.
I thought you were going to say come in the winter, and if you survive, then you're ready. Then you can open a school.
But I'm trying to recruit someone, so I want them to come in the
That's
summer.
Right. Yes. It's beautiful. It's 80 degrees and sunny at all times in Maine. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. We're at the end of March right now, and part of me is thinking, are you sure you want to come to Maine and open a charter school now?
Yeah.
So we have a website. It's maine.gov/CSC, and all of the details to get more information about opening a school or just learning more about us as an authorizer are on that website. My personal contact information is also there. I'd be happy to talk to anyone and everyone if they're interested in coming north. Come to Maine. It's a great place to be.
All right. That's a perfect place to wrap things up. Thanks so much for being here, Lana. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to Charter School Insider. This show is brought to you by BuyQ, the group purchasing organization specifically for charter schools. Want to learn how to maximize your school's purchasing power? Join together with thousands of other charter schools by visiting buyq.org/sign-up. BuyQ's purchasing program is free and has no obligations or commitments required. If you enjoyed today's episode, do us a favor and subscribe on your podcast listening platform of choice. If you have a question or feedback for us, we'd love to hear from you. Send us an email at podcast@byq.org. Thanks, and we hope you'll tune in for the next one.